Okay, so welcome to the Sentient Media podcast, where we chat with the people who are changing the way we think about and interact with the world around us. And today I am absolutely thrilled to invite an award-winning journalist, Jenny Splitter, to share her experiences with us. Her work covers food, agriculture, science, climate, health, for outlets like Vox, The Observer, The Guardian, Everyday Health, Washington Post, New York Magazine. She's also co-founder of SciMoms. So welcome, Jenny, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excited to have you. And I wanted to just start by saying one thing that I've mentioned to you about what I love about your work. You have a really holistic approach to your reporting, or to food systems reporting, it seems to me. You cover all these topics which intersect, like mental health and food, the climate and food, farmers' rights and food. But I was wondering, did you always have that kind of approach to talking about or thinking about food systems, or is that something that evolved as you started writing about it?
No, it definitely evolved. When I started out, I, was writing in some ways in very narrow way. I feel like at least, or I was approaching topics, I think, philosophically in a kind of a narrow way, because I was writing about just sort of almost science explainers in a way of what's a GMO, what do the studies show about the safety of GMOs? And there was nothing, those were accurate topics. And I think even then I did try to bring in, we also need to consider the impacts of pesticides on say the community where the, agricultural communities. But I think over the years, I've stopped sort of throwing those in as asides and tried to take a bigger look at kind of the whole food system and all the different impacts that we need to consider. It's hard. And I think that's, it does take a lot of reading and talking to different experts, I think, to start appreciating the bigger picture. But it's definitely been a process for me.
Yeah, and for me, starting at Sentient Media a couple of years ago, I was like, all of a sudden, everything is related to food, and everything is related from our perspective to animal exploitation, from food to makeup to clothes to everything else. So it's as soon as you start digging into it, you're like, oh my gosh, it's just one big web, and we have to acknowledge it all in order to really talk about it and understand it.
I feel like for me, thinking about the sort of the inner life of the animal has been the last part. So I'm very interested in learning more about it now. And I think just discovering that there is a lot of science on that, and there's still a lot we don't know, but I'm a nerd for all that. I love learning kind of more science and reading the studies. But that's definitely was kind of the final part of it for me. And I think also, relatedly starting to cover biodiversity, that did help things click and realize you sort of can't separate the environment from, all the different sort of creatures that live in it, not just us. So that was probably one big moment for me, big aha moment, as Oprah says, to figure things out.
That's really interesting. So so did you start from the environmental perspective? Is that what was kind of driving your work?
Well, actually, I kind of started from I started covering plant-based meats at Impossible when they kind of were, I didn't start doing that. I was writing about other things. But when I got into more of the environmental climate impacts, the entryway was oh, there's these new burgers kind of made with food science, and how did they do that? And because of the sort of genetic engineering component with Impossible, that kind of led me into that, because I'd already been covering, GMOs and different types of genetic engineering. So that was kind of the first part. And then I became a contributor for Forbes, kind of on the ag tech, food tech beat, and was writing a lot about all those different companies, but that are, making these products. And then I started looking more at the climate impacts of meat, and the role kind of plant-based foods could play in that. And that really captured my attention. I just hadn't put all those things together. I was aware of climate change, obviously, but I hadn't been covering it myself. And so I think realizing food, the quantity of food system emissions, that was kind of a big thing for me to figure out and start and capture my attention and my curiosity. And a lot of, I think for me, over the years, when there's a debate about something, I want to just dive in, get all the sides and get the numbers and try to figure out what's accurate. So that was part of it for me too. There was a lot of debate about, oh, okay, does, meat contribute? Is it 10%? Is it 14%? Is it, or food system emissions 24%, or in the US it's just 10%? And why is that put that way? And who's doing that and why? That was very confusing for me. And I really I knew if it was confusing for me, it was confusing for other people. And I wanted to kind of get all the information I could about that and try to clarify it for myself and for readers.
That debate about the actual number, I find, is like so distracting for people.
Yeah.
It's almost like the climate change denial, where that becomes the topic of conversation. The topic of conversation isn't, what's actually happening. It's, oh, is it real? Is it not real? And now the conversation is like, oh, is it 14%? Is it 30%? Is it, 80%? I mean, we did a quick study back in 2019, and we looked at the amount of times animal agriculture was reported on as part of the impact on climate crisis or greenhouse gas emissions compared to aviation. And aviation was reported on 120 times more for its impact than animal agriculture was. So we're looking at this like, but we know even by the lowest estimation, aviation 5%, animal agriculture 14.5% from the lowest end of the estimation. Why is aviation being reported on 120 times more? I mean, it seems like this massive blind spot that in the media, that we're just not talking about it. And I don't know why that is. Is it because it's meat? Is it because it makes people question ethics? Is it because of, invested interests from, those people running the meat and dairy industry?
I mean, it's all those things. And I think also even in climate change media, it's, I mean, most of the focus rightly has been on fossil fuels and energy. And I think all of that coverage has been very important. We're just sort of behind on the animal ag contribution to it. And I'd love to see that study. I need that, but it doesn't surprise me because it's completely underreported. And even in kind of climate change journalism circles, people will not quite know they'll think that buying local, for example, is more important than switching to a plant-based diet, reducing their meat intake. And that's just, it continues to surprise me how often that is surprising to people that it's a new fact. And so, that just tells me we need a lot more reporting in that area.
Do you ever find pushback when you're pitching the stories that you're pitching about animal agriculture and climate?
No, I mean, I think not in pitching the stories. I thought you were going to say on social media, say yes all the time. But but I think actually the editors are aware that that's an area we need more coverage of, and it's and people have reached out and assigned me stories for that reason, knowing that I've been covering this. So I think that's a really good sign. I think we're going to get a lot more. We have been getting more coverage. I feel like I haven't quantified that, but and I know we will continue to get more coverage in that area, I think. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's really nice to hear. And I mean, one of the things that strikes me when I look at your work, we've spoken before about our Sentient Media Writers Collective, working with advocate writers, trying to understand how to pitch and get stories placed in mainstream media. One of the things I noticed with your work, you are so good at couching like animal ethics and injustices through this human lens, or even through like a practical, like a data-driven lens. Is that intentional, or is it is that intentional?
I mean, I think my like my comfort blanket is data. Even though like I'm not, like I actually struggle with numbers. I wish I had taken like more stats in college or something, because I feel like, now I'm like, oh, I use this all the time. And I'm still like, I have to really be careful about all that stuff, because I'm like a poli-sci major and went to recovering lawyer. But I do notice, like, I think, and maybe it is the recovering lawyer, latent lawyer left in me, that like I am much more comfortable just sort of almost taking myself out of it and going like, well, the facts are this. And I do think there's a lot of value to that. But I just had talked about this on my, I do have a newsletter, and I've been doing sort of podcasts with it now. I just kind of started experimenting with it. Substack made that a thing. But I notice I myself am very uncomfortable talking about my own feelings about animals, and kind of weighing into that. Whereas in some other areas, I'm maybe, not as uncomfortable with it. And why is that? And so I like kind of thinking about all of that. But I do think, in general, for reporting, there is a lot of value in, as I used to write kind of more reported essays, like personal essays, and I still do that for my newsletter, but with the data in there. And I do switch back and forth. I like both, but I think there's a lot of value in just having that reporting. And, as I think journalist Tamar Haspel, who's at the Post, says, like, let the data speak for itself, tell the story through the data. And that's very hard to do, but I think it's important because it can persuade people if sort of presented in the right way. I think, there's definitely an art in mixing kind of the storytelling and the data in a way that's accurate and also engaging. So that's a tough, balancing act. But I think that can be very valuable because then people sort of, I think, have come to trust me in the sense that they know at least that I'm not just like, well, this is my opinion just because. They know I've at least, even if I have arrived at, at a point of view at the end of it, it's because I have looked at the data. So that there is value in that, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that that's something that we do as well at Sentient Media, this kind of balance between presenting the data, presenting the facts, but making sure there is an emotional hook and connection for people, because ultimately we are persuaded by emotions, right? Do you view, like, this is one of the challenges that we have thinking about the media in general. It's so difficult to measure or put your finger on exactly the impact of an article or a story in terms of behavioral change. Have you done any research in looking at how media, articles can impact and then actually create behavioral change or persuade people to do things differently?
I feel like I'm just starting to think about what is the most kind of effective means of sort of achieving behavioral change. I just been looking into this sort of like nudge theory idea of just basically just incremental steps and what does small steps do. And I really just started thinking, because now I'm sort of trying to build this newsletter of my own, even, and also, still write for others. But yeah, what can that impact be? Is there value in just sort of having a small community, though, that you really engage with and reach? So yeah, I haven't done a lot of research into that, and I would like to do more. I know that can be very hard to measure. Any kind of surveys of people are sort of tricky and can be unreliable, and they're hard to frame. I even just took a journalist survey. It was sort of like, why did you frame the questions that way? But I think the surveys are hard to design and they're not, always super reliable. But and I think also it's always going to be a number of different things together that add up to get people to change. And probably if we're talking about diet, it's going to be like, we're working on reducing and then reducing more, and kind of like these little steps. I don't think, anything, I don't think dietary change likely is going to happen overnight for most people. I actually find that to be kind of a problem with the discourse around, plant-based substitutes and are they successful? Because right now we see a lot of people who are trying them out of curiosity. And so there's this big pushback of like, well, that means that then they're not displacing meat consumption and therefore they're not successful. And it's like, well, or they're not successful at displacing meat. Maybe they're making money for the company. I think it's a fair criticism that the companies want to make money, but I also think we don't know yet if they're successful at displacing meat, because they just, they haven't been around that long, and we haven't really been talking about the impacts of meat that long. So it's like, give it time, and obviously, more action the better, more I think more talk is better, but I don't think you're going to see an immediate switch to anything. So I think it's not fair to maybe discount a solution just because doesn't get people to make this massive dietary switch overnight, or even in a year, or 2 years. Like, it's going to take more time than that, and that's okay. That's like my little pet peeve rant, but that's just something that drives me crazy.
Yeah, I hear you. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think you're right. I mean, things do take time, and it does take a minute for, I mean, even for access to these substitutes. A lot of people who
Yeah.
would try them, they might not be able to access them. There are loads of products that I can get in the States that I can't get when I'm in the UK. Like, I don't know where they have Just Egg, but they certainly don't have it anywhere around me. So, things like that. But one thing that is measurable is, of course, views. And we know that if we're getting a lot of views, then we're reaching a lot of people and having a lot of impact. And I'm bringing this up because the New York Times opinion section has just brought out a 3-part series, We're Cooked, which, as you know, has been very, very well watched. It's been viewed by far more people than you could hope to reach with this kind of content. And I'm going to give a brief overview of this 3-part series for people who haven't seen it. And if you haven't watched it, I would encourage you to pause, go and watch all 3 of them. They're about 10-11 minutes long each. There's 3 of them, and then rejoin the episode, because Jenny, I want to get your opinion on this. So episode 1 started with Cory Booker and co talking about the people funding the climate crisis, and spoiler alert, they nail it on animal agriculture. And I was watching that, honestly, I felt like shutting down Sentient Media, because I was like, they've done it. They've absolutely nailed it. Like, they've brought out climate crisis, animal agriculture, money. They've found all of the trails. It's just amazing. Nobody can argue with that. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is just wonderful. I mean, not wonderful that Sentient Media would be closed, but I was like, the fight is won, right? Nobody needs to do anything anymore. Let's just go chill on an island somewhere. And then number 2 comes out, and it's Leah Garces of Mercy for Animals. Amazing. She takes us into the chicken farm, uncovering the true cost of this cheap chicken meat. But it's not just that, it's also devastated farmers, it's dying chickens, devastated farmers, a dying industry, people being exploited. And then it's also the money. They follow the money and they look at the profits of pilgrims, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is just fantastic. You're bringing together all of these aspects that make this industry so corrupt and so powerful, and you're exposing it. You're doing it. This is amazing. And then we come to the 3rd chapter, which you're like, okay, there's three episodes, right? The 3rd one's going to be the solution. What's it going to be? Is it going to be cultured meat? Is it going to be plant-based meat? Is it going to be chickpeas? And then like, it's insects. They bring it out, and it's insects, and it's not just insects. They're saying that insects need a rebrand, like we rebranded lobsters. Lobsters which have now been scientifically found and proven to be sentient, to the extent that we're not allowed to boil them alive anymore. And insects who we also have like more and more data coming out about the sentience of insects, about the things that we don't understand. And of course, they don't. The way that they present it in this video is without criticism. It's like a puff piece for insect farming. It's like, this is the solution to those previous 2 problems that we just showed you. The answer is insects. And I couldn't believe it. And it felt like such a letdown that these other 2 amazingly composed and made videos were just leading up to this insect farming video, where there was absolutely no investigation into any of the negative impacts of insect farming, or any of the potential negative potential impact of insect farming. And it was just it infuriated me. How did you get on with it?
It's so interesting to hear your takes on it. Do you know around what the views were? Because I actually didn't look at that. You're clearly better at quantifying these. I mean, obviously you run Sentient Media, so that makes sense. But
it was hundreds. It was like hundreds of thousands within the first couple of days. But I'll get the numbers up now while you continue.
Well, I think it's interesting. So there was a lot of pushback and sort of food observer advocate journalist circles for the first one. I don't know if people knew it was going to be, I didn't know it was going to be serious. It was a little confusing the way it's put on the sort of page, but I actually think it's probably because they're wanting to have it more shared, online, and or not online, but sort of in, YouTube, like sort of more, you can tell I'm really savvy on all the video applications, but I think that was probably more the idea. But anyway, there was more of there was a lot of pushback to that first one because of what I was hearing, and I felt a little bit of this too, is the tone and the close-ups of the gnashing of the teeth, which was a little like, okay, guys. Yeah, so I didn't say anything about it, and then I noticed a few other people tweeting about that too. They're like, I agree with this, but sort of the close-ups, I could deal without the close-ups of the meat eating. And the announcer's tone is a bit much. And I kind of agreed with that, although maybe that's just, I mean, I'm sure that it is supposed to be engaging. And so I don't know, I had more questions than answers about that, let's say. But ultimately, once there was starting to be a lot of criticism to it in terms of like, oh, why didn't you feature more rural people is what I was hearing. This is before part 2 came out, I believe. And small farmers and small farming solutions like regenerative agriculture, which is like the constant, battle in the sort of circles I see now. And I felt like I just wanted to, well, I did tweet about this, but I was saying like, okay, like it's not perfect in terms of the tone. And there was some inaccuracies in there, which go to my Twitter for more, just little details here. There was an ag economist like presented as a lobbyist, which is not accurate. But anyway, there was a couple things like that. But ultimately, Jennifer Jacquet, who's sort of the researcher who is profiler, has amazing work and really important work. So I feel like that was really important to capture. And we didn't need to go right to solutions, especially not necessarily small farms can save, small meat farming and livestock production in the small scale can save the world, which I feel like has, much like the insect solution, there's many questions about that. There's problems with that, and those would need to be scrutinized. Can that scale? I don't think it really can scale, but at least talk about it is what I always say. I'm not saying to never talk about it, but at least ask the question of, can this scale? So I felt like the pushback to that first one was, just a bit over the top, and people sort of maybe not wanting to stop and really just let kind of the facts about the lobbyists just sort of stand for themselves. I think that was really important for people to see, and not necessarily jump to, oh, don't worry, we could just fix it all with small farms. So I was glad they did it like that, and I was kind of annoyed by some of the pushback to that. And I thought the second part was perfect. Like I don't know if I got used to the announcer or what, but there was a little bit of close up on chicken eating. But so maybe I just sort of got used to that. But in general, I really like that they centered animals in that part and had interviews with the farmers. I've covered this issue for Vox and before at Forbes, actually, have just interviewed Leia and also, the different groups that are working on trying to help contract chicken farmers transition out of that. It's really tough. It's really complicated. I know, a lot of groups are hoping for some sort of policy help there. That's seems like a long road, and, not a lot of promise there, but that would make a big difference. But what I really liked about that second part is that they, really centered the animals and talked about the impacts. And then I think, I didn't even watch the whole part 3 because I've covered insect production. I will say, like, I am a person who probably also didn't consider, the inner life of the insect, various different insects before, like until recently. And I read Jeff Sebo's essay in Eon, online. And that really opened my eyes because I hadn't thought about that either. I had covered insect production and that industry before, and was mostly looking at like how feasible, all the data that I like, the easier parts for me anyway, of like how feasible is this? It's really early days for this industry. And right now they're mostly making ingredients to go to feed companies, which is not displacing animal production. It's kind of supplementing it. Like maybe it would bring down greenhouse gases a little bit, but we're not even at that point now. And I think the people, at least the folks I spoke to who were at these companies would readily say like they're now building, the factories for this, and it's not at all at scale. And I don't think anyone, as I'm sure better than me, it's like animals and how they feel about insects, in this case, how they feel about it is kind of goes to the last thing that we look at sometimes, which can be extremely frustrating. And so I do think, like, I guess in my own journey, it is like moving towards this more holistic view of like, okay, what are all the impacts? Like, what does it look like to farm thousands of insects or whatever? Like what's the impact on the insects? So what would be the impact of the community nearby? What does this really displace? What can they really do? There's so many different ways of looking at it. And I think it's tough to convey that to readers. It's tough to get someone who's not really interested in looking at all the different impacts. But that's kind of what I hope for people, is to get to like unlock that curiosity, so we all kind of ask more questions about everything that we're eating, because it all has some impact. So I think that those are good questions to be asking. And yes, those weren't really questions that were being asked in that, the third part of that piece. But it is great that overall, especially with that first one, and the second one, that they got that many views. I mean, that is important. That's good to reach that many people.
Yeah, and you're talking about a channel which has over 3 million people on it, right? Just in that alone. So not even considering the social media views and all of the
right.
other coverage on there as well. But yeah, it to me, it was just so disappointing, and it just destroyed the whole series for me, that third one. And I guess I was so excited at the beginning because of this. It is so rare for us to see the media tackle and actually talk about animal agriculture in a smart and thorough way.
Yeah.
And then to get to the third chapter and it to be, this is the solution, it was just so like, yeah, it was very like upset, it was just annoying. And then to just,
well, it shows you how tough it is to talk about solutions, because there can't, and I just had it on earlier this morning, so that part is fresh in my mind, of like, there is no single solution, even in to climate change, and even into like the food system. And so I think probably what would have been better is to look at like all these solutions, because I think that comes up with plant-based meat too, or lentils. Not everyone's going to switch to lentils. Okay, that's fine. We don't need everyone to switch to lentils. We don't need everyone to switch to impossible meat, or like, we don't have to do all of that. We can have a combination of these solutions, some of them. And I think ultimately at this stage, we're not in a point to go like, let's just put all our money in insects, even if it were like this amazing, I don't know, even if the potential were really amazing, but say it would be devastating for cruelty to insects, like say that were true. We're not at a point yet to say like, this is it, because it's not ready to go. Like, that industry is not scaled up. So I think we as a society, as a globe, as whatever, like, we need to be looking at a lot of different solutions and really comparing them and see which ones can be compatible. There's a lot of like regen ag versus plant-based, but actually like something like agroforestry can be more compatible with some of these, that isn't so necessarily dependent on livestock, can be more compatible with eating more plants. There's a lot of different combinations that could be explored, I think, that could work together, even still centering like biodiversity and preventing animal cruelty. So I think would have been better to like look at a lot of these solutions together.
Agreed. Let's make it and send it to them. get it out there. I think
really figure out podcasts, so like, I know I need to
well,
I need some production help on my side.
We can help. I would, it would be great to create that and really send out a message of what the actual alternatives are and contribute to that discussion rather than But well, you mentioned there about farmers, and I did really like your piece for Vox. I've got the title, which was "What a Meatless Future Could Mean for Farmers." And in that article, you really talked about how complex it is for people who are farming animals to be a part of a plant-based future. And I was wondering, either from your article or from other work that you're looking at, like, what do you think we neglect when we're getting excited about a plant-based future?
Well, I think one of the things people don't fully understand is just how much of the current cropland, I mean, you understand, but like most people probably don't understand how much cropland is going to feeding animals. So it's just that there's a lot of different farmers that would be impacted if we were to, transition to more plants and other alternative proteins than say just the ranchers or the farmers. And then, so I think that's part one, is like there's all the sort of different types of, well, there's like different crop farmers that are involved. And then I think the other part is like how different and diverse livestock farmers are also. Just, I mean, there's sort of, in a way, the reason that the contract chicken farmers are so willing to talk about transition is because their situations are so crappy. Like their contracts are very crappy with these meat companies, and a lot of them are in debt or not making money because of these, they didn't really necessarily understand the terms of the contracts, or the contracts changed and all this different stuff. So, but if you look at sort of like a cattle rancher, that's a whole different set of challenges. And even because ground beef and sort of is so efficiently produced in the US, you can just, there was a study that just came out of this, about this, that was sort of done with Breakthrough Institute and Jason Lusk, who's an agricultural economist, basically showing that, sales of plant-based meat, even if they're sort of impressive right now, or even if, as they're growing, aren't displacing meat, in part because you can get so much ground beef from a single cow. Like in the US, it's just incredibly productive. So I feel like ranchers would be the last, like they're going to continue to sell meat even if we're selling a lot of plant-based burgers, whereas a chicken farmer is going to have a different situation. I feel like I'm not explaining this very well because it is so complicated. Like there's so many different little factors to it. But basically each, area of meat production, I think, kind of has different concerns. They have different impacts. They have different financial challenges and interests. There's also like, who owns the land? A lot of farmers are leasing land, or sometimes they own part of the land, they lease the other part. There's just a million different factors like that. There's not also a lot of policy interests in the US anyway, in terms of sort of looking at transitioning farmers, or, sort of paying farmers or helping them transition. There is some of it in terms of conservation. It wouldn't be really a transition, but more like, okay, could we get you to rewild, this part of your land? So there's that sort of thing, but there's not, a big piece of legislation to like help like struggling poultry farmers, as was in this second New York Times video, to sort of help them get on their feet and do something else. So it's just really complicated. And I think like I had a hard time getting it all into just this one story. It's kind of an ongoing story. And I think it's hard to actually find successful, like even poultry farmers who have transitioned, because what they do after that is so complicated. It's like, or just so tricky to transition to. Like, okay, you're going to grow hemp. What's the hemp market like? I mean, that's a whole new crop area. It wasn't as regulated, and now it's, starting to be more regulated. So it was kind of an exciting little boom area for some farmers, but then now there's more regulation, and that can be complicated. You have to basically find a whole new set of customers to replace that one who was just kind of locked in already. So there's just a lot of challenges to it. And there are some hog farmers who are contract who are also interested in transitioning, but that's an area where there's, in terms of the concentrated facilities, there's a huge environmental impact from the manure. And it would be great, I think, to transition some of those farmers, or even just get them to like reduce, maybe not have the same size facility, not have quite that many animals packed in for a variety of reasons, including animal welfare. But it doesn't seem like there's a lot of people working on that. So that's, an area of frustration for sure. Like whenever I go to cover the sort of policy part of it, it feels very frustrating, because it feels like it's not logical. So it doesn't have like in some ways I it's nice to talk to scientists because they sort of lay their argument out very logically, or an economist or something like that. And then you get to the policy space and it's just like, I have no, throw it all up in the air because it doesn't make sense. And it's not going to be sort of this like science-based approach, no matter what anyone's saying. It's really just like who has the influence and, you know, what people can be brought to the table to make a deal, at least in the US, which I'm more familiar with. But yeah, so it's very frustrating to cover. I don't see a lot of action. And that's, at this point, it's just sort of like raise more awareness about it so maybe people can be more interested. And hopefully that may influence how they vote. You know, it's not just what they do as consumers, but also, you know, we need more kind of collective action beyond that. So that's kind of the point I feel like I'm at with it. It's not a lot of great news. It's just sort of like early days of trying to get people aware of it so we can maybe put pressure on lawmakers and also, you know, affect how what they purchase and eat.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And essentially it's all neglected, like coverage of all of it, of all of that issue that the farmers are facing, from contract farmers to livestock farmers. Yeah, the issues that they're facing aren't being spoken about.
And even like for farmers themselves, like there's a lot of pushback for the ones who do speak out. I mean, that's a whole huge problem, I think. Like there are farmers who are willing to speak out and criticize their own industry or have conversations, like really honest conversations, but it is hard to find those farmers. And when sometimes, you know, they do speak out and they're not male and not white, they get a lot of online abuse or in-person abuse. And so it's just that's also like, I think the culture of agriculture in the US, it is really a challenging one. It's going to be a challenging one, I think, to sort of get on board with the kind of climate action we really need. And, you know, I think there's also at the same time a lot of disinformation coming out from these lobby groups, industry groups who are like, you know, don't believe this coverage because I have this one expert here who's going to tell you what you want to hear. And just that way you can just like, you know, stick to your guns and not start, you know, working with other stakeholders like environmentalists, like, you know, animal welfare groups, like consumers who are interested in the food system. Like instead of talking to them, they're kind of like, you know, trying to stoke that rage or whatever. And that's also hindering any kind of progress, I think. Not any progress, but it's hindering progress for sure.
Have you looked at like the subsidies model in the US?
Yeah, a little bit. I feel like I'm not as well versed on it as others, but and it's also just like confusing because there's like even the farm bill is confusing. It's all this different like legislation packed in. There's so many different aspects to it and ways to kind of nudge things. But I know, and there's a lot of different ways for farmers to get paid. And sometimes I think, because I'm sort of going through this now, writing a piece on carbon farming and some of the issues with that. But part of it is like trying to really look at the numbers and put it in context. Like, okay, so you could get this amount for cover crops in the state. You could get this amount for from a carbon credit company, and what do those numbers mean compared to each other? And also, is it an individual farmer? Is it a company? Even though it's an individual farmer at the head, like that farmer has employees. So something that goes like, oh my God, how'd they get this much amount of money? Well, it also goes to their landholder, you know, their landlord who owns the land, and their employees. So it's like sorting out, putting those numbers in context is really challenging. And chasing down all the money and where it goes is challenging.
Yeah, I guess that's by design, right? They don't
Right,
want
of
it
course.
to be, they don't want it to be simple.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that you mentioned in your, I think this was still in the Vox piece as well, was such a comprehensive investigation. And like you say, there's still so much more to do. But one of the groups or one of the farmers that you looked at was previously growing, I think in Sweden, was previously growing oats to feed to animals, and now they're selling them to Oatly. Like that just seems like such a simple win. Like, were there any other like successes or any other like models like that you saw where you thought this could be something that could scale?
I don't know if it will scale yet, but I think it's the beginning stages of it for sure. I think, and Miyoko's it has a program for this. Like they also ran into some hurdles early on because of, you know, how challenging it is to get to to transition a dairy farmer, basically. But they're still working on it, and they seem to be truly investing in it in a thoughtful way. And so I think that'll be an interesting company to watch. And I think all of those, like Mercy for Animals, all these different projects will find more success. I think it's just a matter of like trial and experimentation, trial and error, see what works. And then maybe they get more funders for it. So I think those are some interesting projects to watch, and maybe in some cases in the state level, or I think it's going to be a lot of creative experimentation for a while. I was just thinking that, like, you see a lot more interest in plant-based diets in cities. So I don't know if somehow you could have some creative scheme whereby the city government is kind of, investing in some of this in a rural area. That would be wild and crazy. But like, who knows if that could work. But I think it's some of that kind of thinking is going to be maybe what gets things started. And then maybe if that can be successful, then maybe they'll get more sort of like foundation funding, and then maybe policy could follow suit.
That's a really great point. I think it's so similar to the tobacco, to the war on tobacco and the changes that we had to see there in order to step away from. I mean, the economy in the US was dependent on tobacco and tobacco farmers, and there was huge subsidies. That's how the tobacco industry was successful. So it seems like a similar transitional period that we need to enter, and what we get, how we kind of tip that balance to actually start creating that change, and changing the policies and changing the subsidies, and like you say, a lot of creative thinking. One of the other
one thing to mention that I think makes this, and I don't know how this compares to tobacco, I should look into this, maybe but I know one of the things that makes it challenging is that there's the subsidy component, but also it is actually just become cheaper and cheaper to grow like corn. So, and more efficient because of, the companies making like just the science behind it partly. So it's not like, I guess the complicated factor, as I understand it, is that yes, we subsidize the wrong things, but also that won't fully sort of account for like just the how cheap it is to make sort of cheap food in various formats, and how expensive it can be to grow like fruits and vegetables. Now grains could be better, so like oats are a great thing, right? Because that could be like cheaper to farm and maybe grow it at scale. So it's there, we need people at the policy level basically thinking like that, more sophisticated than what I just said, to really like, okay, like to sort of be thinking from that perspective, rather than just like rewarding the same things we've always been rewarding. That's like the missing link, because I'm sorry, rambling, but it's like, it's basically, there's all these complicated factors beyond just like switching the subsidies that need to be figured out at the policy level.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is complex, and there are so many things that need to be considered and applied, and somebody in a policy making position would be it would be great.
We're not seeing that, so I guess it's like we as the voters or whatever like need to be really like making a fuss for that. I guess that's kind of the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, another issue that you look at and have covered a fair bit, especially in a piece last month for The Guardian, is greenwashing. And you wrote the piece, America has a manure problem and the miracle solution being touted isn't all that it seems. And we're talking about these digesters, right? And which apparently convert, billions of tons of manure from animal farms into reusable energy. Could you explain a little bit about what the digesters are for people who might not know?
Yeah, I think it seems like they've been put into use more in other countries besides the US anyway. And so I guess it's confusing. Even in this piece where I tried to explain it, I got people saying, you didn't make it clear that the manure is still there. And I'm like, oh, didn't we? Okay. But it's just like, there's so many details to it. But basically, and these digesters can do it with lots of different organic material. It could be food waste or scraps or whatever. But when they're located on farms, basically they extract the methane and some other gases from the manure. the manure sort of gets concentrated and then that gets separated out. And so you can then use that methane. You have to process it a little bit, and then you can use it to sort of like power things on the farm. Or, and this is where it starts to get trickier, is like you could sell it to the natural gas companies, basically. And in some cases, it's like that could be extracted in Maine, but be an offset in California. There's just a lot of weird things happening with the natural, or things to watch, I should say, from the natural gas industry perspective, because they would like to keep growing and not be restricted. So that's one area of growth, is, you know, sort of trying to figure out ways where these big farms can extract the methane and then sell it as renewable gas. And then the manure is left over. And, you know, there are some scientists who have studied sort of the best ways to use that digestate. And it is possible to apply it in ways that would be more environmentally friendly. But as with everything in agriculture, that's not happening. Like, it's sort of like the running theme of like, there's some great scientists, or like, you know, a handful, one or two, working on these ways to make things more environmentally friendly. But in practice, that information doesn't always get to the farmer. And the companies who are kind of the biogas companies growing area, they're not necessarily interested in promoting that. They're not, you know, creating an infrastructure where like this digested manure is, you know, put back into the environment in a more environmentally conscious way. It's just like a free-for-all with farmers. And so they are kind of trying to figure out what to do with it, and not finding a way to sell it like what they were told, like, oh, you can sell it to potting companies, garden companies, all these different things. And in theory you can, but like in practice, there isn't necessarily sort of a you know, a market for it. There isn't a person right there telling them like, oh, okay, here, like now put it on this truck and sell it here. And by the way, you're in the middle of running like your poultry farm anyway, and you've got a lot going on. So the manure is just like sitting there in a, you know, in a storehouse, you know, or getting distributed to fields in not the right way. And then it leaches off into waterways and causes more pollution. So there's some potential there, but it's basically like anything else. And this involves the agriculture industry and the natural gas industry. It's money driven. You know, they're just sort of figuring out ways to tell people, oh, we're creating renewable gas, we're turning poop into energy. It's great. We're saving the planet. And meanwhile, we're going to make like tons of money on it, or get all these government subsidies for it. Like, you know, in California, there's a lot of there was a law basically passed that kind of requires people to reduce their methane emissions, and so it's really attractive in California, but like there's no infrastructure or enforcement to make sure it actually is deployed in a way that's environmentally conscious. Like it just doesn't happen really. So I think that's the really frustrating part, is like I'll talk to a scientist at EPA who's just like, oh, but like here's this study and you can talk to this person. And then I'll talk to a farmer who could maybe be the beneficiary of that, a crop farmer who could have bought that digested manure. And they're like, have no idea that's even in the state of Maryland. Who's doing it? You know, no one went and talked to them. And so it's sort of like, it's just, there's no action to follow up whatever like good intentions might be there, on the part of the scientists anyway. I don't know about the companies, but yeah, so that's sort of the frustrating part. And I think the even worse, like these digesters are kind of one of the few things the Biden administration pointed to is like, oh, we're going to take climate action. Look, we've got these on-farm digesters, without really explaining it. And this is probably, you know, not the best thing to be starting with when there's all these problems.
Yeah, right. And I think that is essentially it. That's where the greenwashing comes in, because they can say that the farm is, you know, environmentally friendly, etc., because of saying that they have the digesters, even though, like you say, they're not necessarily doing anything with it. And it's the same, you know, with the fishing industry. We see this time and time again. You know, this is environmentally friendly fish, whatever, because, and then there's no actual enforcement of these ideas, like you say, that might be coming from the right place. But unless we're enforcing them, then it's meaningless, isn't it? We mentioned at the start about this holistic approach, and I think we've definitely uncovered all of the kind of facets and the complexity of what it is that you do when you're reporting, the detail and the level to which you explore and investigate all of these different aspects of all of these different verticals. But you're also like, you're an optimistic seeming person, and you maintain optimism when you're talking, and curiosity, and you talk about mental health and well-being. I was wondering, like, how do you keep your motivation when you're carrying out these really in-depth, sometimes quite somber investigations that you do?
Well, it's funny because I'm working on a little newsletter issue on this right now, because I had been covering like all these optimism researchers, and I had this kind of flawed idea of what the study of optimism is. I think I don't remember what year this was. Time has no meaning anymore. But my sister at some point years ago was like, "Oh, I'm reading this book on happiness, and it's really great." And I was like, I'm not looking at it. Like I was sort of, I think this was when positive psychology was just kind of becoming a thing that the public was paying attention to. And my understanding of it was more like toxic positivity. That's kind of a term you hear, where it's like, only look at the bright side, like these sort of inspirational memes on Instagram or whatever, and just like, shut out whatever negative thing is happening. But actually, optimism researchers don't ask you to do that at all. And in fact, a lot of them study people who've experienced real trauma and living in like civil war and all kinds of horrific situations, and are able to find resilience. And how do they do that? And it starts with actually just acknowledging all the bad stuff. Like don't try to change that. But how can you find meaning and hope and take small steps towards, towards solutions, towards, just to make your life better. In the optimism view, it's sort of just like, what is something that makes you happy each day, and maybe doing a little more of that, something like that. I feel like for climate action, it's like, okay, let's look at what are the small steps I can take that make a difference, which could be just talking to someone about climate change. And for me, honestly, becoming vegan made me incredibly happy, which I think is like kind of weird and surprising, because I feel like there's this idea that it's like so hard, and that like vegans are all like dour and just like, constantly just talking about horrible things. But I actually feel like one of the joys has been discovering like vegan Twitter. I find it all really like, there's so many funny people, and I like looking at their videos, and I love looking at food. Like it just combines a lot of my interests in terms of cooking. And so little things like that, make me happy in the times when I'm not covering the sort of the bad things. I'm still covering the bad things. I keep that in my brain. But I also spend time like, watching some guy on Twitter make a crazy egg from like a chickpea or something. I don't know how he did it, but it's like, that just sparks my scientific curiosity and makes me happy and keeps me going. So I think a lot of it are these little shifts and reframing, and in your own life to keep it very, very small. And also though, acknowledge like all of the things that are bad, and the things also that you don't have control over. That's a big part of it. Like I can't put Cory Booker in charge of everybody, and like I don't have power over that. I can only do what I can do. I can, maybe publish some pieces. I can uncover things. I can report. I can do my part there. I can work on my newsletter. I can talk to people in my everyday life. I do that, but like I can't, make these huge sweeping changes, and really few of us can. So that's okay. And to just sort of like keep that kind of, in your mind of like, okay, here's what I can't control, and here's the things that I can do, and what are these little steps you can take every day. And that has worked in like many areas of my life. It kind of helped me get through the pandemic, when my kids were just like, we're all stuck at home, when this like not have a lot of space, like just these little, focusing on these little steps, what are little things, day by day, stay in the moment, that kind of a thing. While still, without trying to sort of put on this like happy facade. Like you don't have to do any of that. Just, sort of acknowledging joy where you find it, really. It's just kind of like as simple as that. But I think partly because I have that scientific curiosity, like it kind of turns that staying curious, and that actually is a part of optimism research. I think that helps a lot, as sort of like, turning on that part of your brain that's curious, rather than like, I must be happy, or, oh, like just trying to, like, don't try to fix yourself, basically. Just sort of like, turn on the part of your brain that like enjoys learning about things, or whatever those things may be. And that's kind of how I've like survived.
That's super interesting. I've never thought of it like that, because you do get into a rut, or you get into a kind of a downward spiral, or a doom loop. Yeah, and you're like, this is it. But just sparking curiosity, or just doing something like that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a really nice way to look at it. I mean, I don't know if it's because I'm British and very cynical, but I hate all of that Instagram,
Totally.
eat whatever in the sun, whatever stuff. Like I can't deal with any of it. So, but that makes a lot of sense what you just said. So yeah, that's
It's
cool.
a huge turning point for me, like in many areas of my life, because I was pretty down for parts of the pandemic. It just felt like, I don't know. I mean, also because I think being part of Sci Moms, where we were writing a lot of, I wasn't writing them, I was helping kind of edit some of these FAQs on COVID, and just looking at kind of how globally and as a country we're handling the crisis. It was really discouraging to feel like we just have not prioritized public health. That was really, really hard for me. And it just, in addition to feeling like, as a family, like, how am I going to get my kids to be able to socialize again? Like, so much was happening at once. And so, yeah, I guess just like reframing really helped me get through, because it just was a matter of like making these little switches and really shifting how I looked at things without trying to change who I am. And I like become some bright sider or whatever, who always sees the positive. Didn't have to do that.
Yeah, I think there's something to be taken from what you've just said when it comes to, inciting behavioral change in others. Because if we're, in the vegan movement, you've probably noticed on vegan Twitter, there can be a lot of, dictatorial approaches to veganism, and demanding, myself included, everyone go vegan, blah blah. But I think that idea of actually sparking curiosity in people, rather than forcing them to change who they are, whatever it is, I think that's something that could be taken away for our writing, the way that we talk about eating meat and eating plant-based.
Yeah, I feel like in my own life, when I was telling people that I was going vegan, it was like such a, not my immediate family, but just like friends, it was just such a like, almost like it didn't stop the conversation, but it was this huge stumbling block of like, what? You're doing what and why? And are you gonna eat honey? And like, it seemed like to me to divert the conversation in a way that was like not helpful. Like, so then I always just, like try to switch it to just like, okay, like we're all trying to hopefully, reduce our consumption. And I get a lot more agreement on that. And then if I think like, okay, so this is a long game, just like we were saying in the beginning with like the plant-based meat sales, like, yes, so people might be curious about trying Impossible Meat, or curious about what I'm doing, instead of it being like vegan or nothing for them, which is like, does not compute. They can't imagine it. And I was like that too. Like for a long time, I was like, I can't give up butter. It's totally impossible, because I love baking. So what will I do? And then now I love vegan baking, and I just like had to learn that. But I guess I use myself as an example in that way. It's like, okay, like over time, I have changed my thinking. And so other people will do that too. We're not static creatures.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great way to look at things. I just have one more question for you, if we have a minute longer. Are there any untold stories that you're desperate to write, if you had to pick one?
That's hard. I'm working on, I guess I don't have a perfect answer for this, but because I'm like deep in this feature on carbon farming right now. But I will say, like, I have been way down this rabbit hole of like soil science, in terms of the real, not some of the debates we read in kind of the coverage, which are a little surface and more about like, kind of quick fixes, basically. But some of the deeper arguments between scientists, really looking at like globally, how can we get all these different types of land to store carbon, are fascinating to me. It's kind of my new thing that I'm obsessed with, because I, didn't really study. I mean, I definitely didn't study science in college. And I was not super interested in high school. So, I mean, even the most basic things I had to kind of figure out, like the carbon cycle. And so it's sort of like, okay, like, and so much is changing in soil science, like the field. Like there's this, basically this idea of like whether we could permanently store carbon. That was kind of the thinking, this humus or whatever, recalcitrant carbon. Like that kind of got debunked basically 10 years ago. And so the field is basically figuring out like, oh, okay, so like it can't be permanent. Can we get it to stay there? What's going on? And I just like love all that stuff. So I guess like, this is like a long way of saying like, I think we should try to embrace and pursue like where there's uncertainty. Like, I think maybe it's not one story, but like, I'm kind of trying to think about this now, like, how can we better convey that many areas of science are evolving. They're going to evolve. And that doesn't mean that like, and you can sort of see this in the immediate sense and with like COVID coverage of like, what the scientists told me last week that this was happening. It's like, yes, and there was a new study. And so how can we sort of convey and talk about and embrace like uncertainty? And I'm a control freak, so that's hard for me, but like, how can we all get to the point where we're like, okay, so the science is going to always be evolving. We're going to get more data. We're going to get more data, and things that might change our understanding when we have more data. And sort of like, how can we kind of unlock that curiosity in everyone and learning about it? Because I think people like certainty. I know I do, but maybe I think ideally we will get to a place where where everybody maybe can become more curious rather than just like locked in their beliefs. I don't know how we do that. But I think that's like so important because so many things change all the time. And we don't want to sort of write something that's like, outdated in a month. Instead, maybe it's like, here's what we know right now, and kind of convey this idea, like, and it's a story that is constantly being told. And scientists are uncovering new things, like, and the same thing with, animal sentience. It's like, we didn't necessarily know what's going on with like insects or whatever 10 years ago. Maybe we did, I don't know. But like, to just kind of get that way of thinking with people, like, we thought one thing because that was the best available evidence, but that might change, and that is going to change probably because now we have more evidence, and that's a good thing. That's exciting. Like to kind of get into that way of thinking, I think is very important. And I do not know how to do it, but I want to know. I want to figure it out. I think that could be a key to maybe, I don't know, making things a little better. I won't, no silver bullet solution. So it certainly won't fix everything. Nothing will, but like, maybe that can just, I don't know, maybe just kind of unlock our curiosity rather than, this way of like being stuck in our points of view.
I love it. I think that's a really wonderful thing to say and a really wonderful approach, and being comfortable with uncertainty, the right kind of uncertainty, I think it makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I'm excited to see what comes out with your new article and your many future pieces. And I just want to tell all of our listeners and viewers to sign up to Jenny's newsletter Future Feed on Substack. Is there any other, and obviously your website, and I'll put all of the links into the show notes here. Is there anywhere else you would like to send our listeners?
I mean, I'm always on Twitter.
Oh yeah,
Twitter of my family. So feel free to tweet me and I'll answer. I think I answer almost everybody unless you're just harassing me forever after a while. Even then, I usually answer you like 2 or 3 times. That's what a sucker I am. But and I'm on Instagram trying to share like my vegan experiments and cooking. So yeah, just I love to connect with people. That's why I do any of this. I love that. So
amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and hearing your perspective. It certainly opened my eyes a lot. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.